I'm a 16-year-old guy living in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and this happened about 6 months ago during an overnight hiking trip. I'd been planning this trip for a while, just a solo trek through the Lost Peak Mountains, about an hour's drive from my place. The original plan was to go with a buddy, but at the last minute, he bailed on me. I thought about canceling, but I had already packed up my gear, and my car was loaded. So I figured, why not? I should have known better. By the time I actually made it to the trailhead, it was later than I wanted, 5:30 p.m., which for anyone who hikes or camps knows is cutting it way too close. But I figured I could cover a couple miles before it got too dark. If I kept a good pace, I could set up camp with just enough time to relax before turning in for the night. Walking in the dark, alone, is unsettling. The trees close in around you, and every sound seems amplified. Soon, it got so dark that my headlamp was the only thing guiding me. The trail stretched ahead in a narrow, winding path, and there wasn't a single sign of another person. It was just me and miles of empty forest. After hiking for a while, I found a clearing that seemed good enough for the night. It wasn't perfect, just a small flat area with an old fire ring, some burned wood, and signs that someone had camped there before, though it had clearly been a while. I set up my tarp, gathered some dry wood, and managed to get a small fire going. The flickering flames made the dark seem a little less overwhelming, and for a while, I was able to just enjoy the quiet. I pulled out a can of chili beans I had packed and let them heat by the fire. The nervousness I'd felt earlier started to fade. I was out in nature, alone, doing something I loved. Yeah, it was eerie, but that was part of the thrill, right? Then, something small landed near my foot. A rock. About the size of a coin. I froze, staring at it. My stomach twisted. Had that just fallen from a tree? I slowly turned my head, scanning the tree line just outside the reach of the fire's glow. My heart pounded as I raised my flashlight and aimed it toward where the rock had come from, but the thick trees and underbrush only let me see about 10 feet ahead. Beyond that, it was pure darkness. For a long moment, I didn't move. I just listened. Silence. After a few minutes, I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had kicked the rock without noticing, or maybe it had fallen from somewhere. My mind was already on edge from hiking alone at night. My brain was probably overreacting. Still, I kept my knife close as I finally laid down to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure why. Everything was quiet, no crunching leaves, no twigs snapping. Just the soft crackling of the dying fire. But as I started to drift back to sleep, I heard it. Crunch. A single step. It was faint, but there. My eyes snapped open, adrenaline surging through me. My first thought was to grab my flashlight, but as I reached for it, my hand hit nothing. Confused, I sat up and scanned the ground next to me. My flashlight should have been right there. I had placed it beside me before I fell asleep. Then I saw it. About 10 feet away, lying in a small pile of leaves, my flashlight was just sitting outside my camp. I stopped breathing. I hadn't moved it. I hadn't touched it. Someone else had. A wave of cold dread crashed over me. My fingers tightened around my knife as I slowly pulled on my boots, trying to stay completely silent. Then, more footsteps. Slow. Casual. Like someone was just strolling through the woods, unbothered. Every instinct in my body was screaming run, but where? My car was 3 miles away, and if I bolted down the pitch-black trail, whoever was out there would have the advantage. I had no choice but to stay put. The footsteps would disappear for a while, leaving me sitting there in agonizing silence only to return again, circling my campsite just outside the fire's dying glow. I couldn't see them, but they were there. And then, the worst part, they stopped. Whoever had been pacing just stood there, completely silent. I clutched my knife so tightly my hands ached. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, waiting for another sound. But none came. When the first rays of sunlight finally cut through the trees, I forced myself to move, my body stiff from staying in the same position all night. Slowly, I scanned the woods, but I was alone. Or at least, it looked that way. I packed up my gear faster than I ever have in my life and practically jogged the 3 miles back to my car. By the time I reached it, my chest was tight with panic, and I fumbled to unlock the doors, climbing inside and locking them immediately. I sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, trying to breathe. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed something. Scrawled in the dust on my car's back window were 2 words. "Sleep tight." I stared at the message, my blood running ice cold. Someone had been watching me, and they had been close enough to touch my car. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from those woods, and I haven't been back since. When I was a teenager, my family used to camp on this private land, out in the western hills of Pennsylvania. It was one of those places where all the nearby cabins belonged to relatives, so we had the whole area to ourselves. Summers were spent playing in the woods, swimming in the river, and telling scary stories around the fire. It was safe, or at least I thought it was. That summer, I was exploring alone as usual when my aunt asked if she could join me. She was way older than me, like 14 years older, but we'd always gotten along. She was almost 6 feet tall, had bright pink hair, and wasn't the type to scare easily. I didn't mind the company, so we took one of the rough dirt trails deeper into the woods, following the river that ran about 150 feet to our right. She mostly wanted to tag along so she could smoke a joint without my grandma noticing. I wasn't into that stuff, so I let her do her thing while I wandered along the edge of the water, watching fish dart under the surface. At some point, the air shifted. Do you ever get that feeling where you just know you're being watched? A sharp click broke the silence. I looked up. There, on the opposite side of the river, maybe 15 feet away, stood a man. I had never seen him before. He wasn't part of the family. He wore a black jacket, worn-out jeans, and in his hands he held an old yellow camera, the kind with a manual dial to advance the film. He was grinning at me. Then, he raised the camera and took another picture. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. He had this scruffy, gaunt look, like he hadn't slept in days. His smile was stretched just a little too wide. I took a step back. He clicked the camera's dial, raised it again, click. I was frozen. I didn't know what to do. Run? Speak? My body wasn't responding. Then, my aunt stumbled out of the trees, mumbling about how much she missed her teenage years. She froze mid-sentence when she saw him. The man ignored her. His focus was entirely on me. Another click. Then, he wagged his finger at me, like he was scolding a child. And that's when I saw it. The knife she strapped to his belt. He slowly raised a single finger and traced it across his throat. My blood turned to ice. I ran. I grabbed my aunt's arm and yanked her forward, my feet barely touching the ground as we sprinted back up the trail. Behind us, I heard another camera click. Then splashing. He was crossing the river. I didn't dare look back. My lungs burned, my legs screamed, but we couldn't stop. The river was deep in some areas, but in others, a full-grown man could wade through easily. He was following us. The path back to the cabins wasn't straight. It twisted through the woods, full of roots and rocks that could send you sprawling if you weren't careful. I barely noticed any of it. I was running on pure adrenaline. Somewhere ahead, the old staircase came into view, the random one in the woods that led to nothing. Without thinking, we ducked behind it, pressing our backs against the cold stone. I clamped a hand over my mouth, chest heaving. My aunt crouched beside me, her eyes wide with terror. Then the sound came. Branches snapping. He was close. I shut my eyes, trying to keep my breathing silent. The snapping twigs grew louder, then stopped. We stayed like that, frozen, listening, waiting. Minutes passed. Then more. Finally, when we didn't hear anything else, we risked it. We ran again, pushing forward, barely able to stay on our feet. Just when I thought we were safe, I tripped. My boot caught on something, and I pitched forward, hitting my head hard against a tree trunk. Pain exploded through my skull. I tasted blood. Dazed, I pressed myself against the tree, trying to make sense of what was happening. My aunt grabbed me, whispering frantically, "We have to keep moving." My ears were ringing. My vision blurred. But the terror in her voice snapped me out of it. I pushed forward, running on pure survival instinct. The second we broke through the trees into my grandmother's yard, I nearly collapsed from exhaustion. My aunt bolted inside, screaming for my grandfather. Within minutes, the entire family was mobilizing. My grandpa grabbed his rifle. My uncle armed himself. Every man on that mountain locked their doors and spread the word. There was no cell service out there. Calling the cops would take over an hour, and by then, whoever that man was would be long gone. My mom arrived soon after and didn't believe us. She thought we had just scared ourselves, that maybe my aunt's weed had made things seem worse than they were. But my aunt knew what she saw, and so did I. That night, for the first time in years, every single door on that mountain was locked. The next morning, the men searched the woods. They found nothing, no footprints, no signs of anyone camping nearby. It was like the man had vanished. To this day, I still wonder. Did he follow us back? Did he watch from the trees while we gathered, whispering about the strange man with the camera? And worst of all, did I end up as part of someone's disturbing photo collection? I try not to think about it. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that click.